A billionaire tech magnate takes his charming secretary on a date to a high-end restaurant. A few moments later, his wife storms in with a furious look on her face. James Harrington had the kind of life most people only dreamed about. From the sleek glass-paneled walls of his penthouse overlooking the city to the private jet that whisked him away to conferences in Tokyo and Paris, he was the epitome of success. As the founder and CEO of one of the most profitable tech firms in the country, he was a household name, a man of influence, wealth, and charm. But it wasn't just the billions in his bank account or the cutting-edge innovations his company produced that made James Harrington a magnet for attention. It was his charisma, the way he could walk into a room and command it without effort. Whether he was charming investors at a gala or sharing a genuine laugh with an employee, people gravitated toward him. By all accounts, James was a man who had it all. A man whose life should have been perfect. And then there was Victoria. Victoria Harrington was the kind of woman who turned heads without trying. Her elegance was understated but undeniable, her beauty matched by an intellect that had once made her a formidable corporate lawyer. She had left that world behind a few years ago, choosing instead to focus on philanthropy. Victoria's days were filled with managing foundations, organizing fundraisers, and advocating for causes she believed in, from education reform to climate action. She and James were the power couple everyone admired, the pair whose love story had been celebrated in magazine spreads and society pages. Yet, beneath the glossy exterior of their marriage, cracks had begun to form. Victoria wasn't sure when she had first felt it. Maybe it was a missed dinner here, an unanswered text there. Or perhaps it was the way James seemed distant, even when they shared the same room. Conversations had grown shorter, their once effortless banter replaced with the perfunctory exchanges of two busy people coexisting. She told herself it was natural, that after 20 years together, any couple might lose some of their spark. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was during one of those rare evenings when they were both home at the same time that she decided to bring it up. "You've been working late a lot," Victoria said, her voice light but probing as they sat across from each other at the dining table. James glanced up from his plate, caught off guard. "It's the new product launch," he replied. "You know how these things are. It's temporary." She nodded, not wanting to push. But as she watched him return his attention to his phone, her heart sank. Temporary. The word lingered in her mind long after they had finished dinner. Meanwhile, at Harrington Technologies, Sophie Bennett was quickly becoming an indispensable part of James's world. Bright, ambitious, and meticulous, Sophie had risen through the ranks with a speed that was both impressive and well-deserved. She was the kind of person who anticipated problems before they arose, who managed to make even the most chaotic days run smoothly. For Sophie, working as James's executive secretary was a dream job. She admired his vision, his work ethic, and though she would never admit it to anyone, his magnetic charm. Sophie prided herself on her professionalism, maintaining a strict boundary between admiration and action. But the long hours and late nights spent together in the office were starting to blur those lines. It began innocently enough. A casual joke here, a shared laugh there. James had a way of making people feel seen, of drawing them in with his warmth. Sophie wasn't immune to it. And James, for his part, found himself enjoying her company more than he expected. She was sharp, witty, and refreshingly candid in a world where most people told him only what they thought he wanted to hear. One evening, as they worked late preparing for an investor presentation, James glanced at Sophie across the conference table. She was focused, her brow furrowed as she reviewed the slides. "You're a lifesaver, you know that?" he said, leaning back in his chair. Sophie looked up, startled by the compliment. "Just doing my job." "It's more than that," James said. "You keep everything running smoothly. I don't know how I managed before you came along." Sophie felt a flush of warmth at his words but quickly pushed it aside. "Well, I'm glad to help," she said, keeping her tone light. Moments like these became more frequent. A lingering glance, a compliment that felt a little too personal, the way their conversations began to stray from work into more personal territory. Sophie found herself looking forward to their interactions, even as she reminded herself that James was her boss, and a married man. James, too, noticed the shift. He told himself it was harmless, that he was simply appreciating Sophie's talents and personality. But he couldn't deny the way his mood lifted when she walked into the room, or the way he found excuses to spend just a little more time with her. At home, Victoria began to notice changes in James that she couldn't quite put her finger on. He seemed distracted, preoccupied. She told herself it was work stress, but the nagging feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. One evening, as she scrolled through her calendar, she realized it had been months since they had spent an evening out together, just the two of them. She decided to change that. "Let's go out this weekend," she suggested as they got ready for bed. "Just us. It's been too long." James hesitated, caught off guard by the suggestion. "This weekend? I might have to work, but I'll see what I can do." Victoria smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let me know." As James drifted off to sleep that night, Victoria lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She had always believed in her marriage, in the bond she and James shared. But for the first time, she found herself wondering if that bond was as strong as she thought. And in the office the next day, as James exchanged another fleeting smile with Sophie, a subtle tension began to build, a tension that neither of them could fully ignore, and one that would soon set the stage for choices that would change everything. The weeks that followed were a blur of late nights, high-pressure meetings, and mounting expectations as the product launch drew closer. James found himself leaning more heavily on Sophie than ever before. She was always there, calm and collected, managing the chaos with an efficiency that seemed effortless. But it wasn't just her competence that drew him in. It was the way she listened, the way she seemed to understand him in a way no one else did. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, James sat in his office, nursing a glass of whiskey. Sophie had just finished briefing him on the next day's schedule when he stopped her as she turned to leave. "Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions?" he asked suddenly, his voice low and almost hesitant. Sophie froze, surprised by the question. She turned back to face him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" James gestured vaguely, as though trying to encapsulate his entire life in a single motion. "This. All of this. The work, the pressure, the expectations. It's like I'm always chasing something, but I don't even know what it is anymore." Sophie hesitated, unsure how to respond. She had never seen this side of him before. James Harrington, the confident, unshakable leader, suddenly seemed vulnerable. "I think everyone feels that way sometimes," she said carefully. "Even people like you." James let out a bitter laugh. "People like me. What does that even mean?" Sophie shrugged, a small smile playing at her lips. "It means you're human. Even billionaires are allowed to feel lost once in a while." For a moment, James just looked at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Thanks, Sophie. I don't know why I'm unloading this on you. You've got enough on your plate." "It's fine," she said softly. "Sometimes it helps to talk about it." That night marked the beginning of a subtle but undeniable shift in their dynamic. What had once been strictly professional began to feel more personal. James started to confide in Sophie more often, sharing frustrations and doubts he had never voiced to anyone else, not even Victoria. And Sophie, despite her initial reservations, found herself drawn to him in ways she hadn't anticipated. She told herself it was harmless. James was just her boss, a man going through a rough patch. But as the days turned into weeks, she couldn't ignore the growing connection between them. It was in the way he looked at her during meetings, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, the way she caught herself thinking about him long after she had left the office. Then, one evening, James asked her to join him for dinner. "It's nothing formal," he said casually as they wrapped up a late meeting. "Just a chance to unwind and talk without interruptions. Besides, I owe you a decent meal after all these late nights." Sophie hesitated. She knew this was crossing a line, even if it was framed as innocent. But she also knew she wanted to go. Against her better judgment, she agreed. The restaurant James chose was understated but elegant, the kind of place where the lighting was low, the wine was expensive, and the tables were spaced far enough apart to ensure privacy. Sophie arrived feeling a mixture of excitement and nerves, her usual work attire replaced by a simple black dress that felt both out of place and entirely fitting for the occasion. James was already there, waiting at the table with a bottle of wine. He stood as she approached, a smile spreading across his face. "You look great," he said, his eyes lingering on her for just a moment too long. "Thanks," Sophie said, her cheeks warming as she took her seat. "This place is nice. I figured we deserved a break from the office," James said, pouring her a glass of wine. "Besides, I think it's about time I thanked you properly for everything you've done." The conversation started innocently enough, revolving around work and the upcoming launch. But as the evening progressed, it began to drift into more personal territory. James spoke about his childhood, his struggles to build his company, and the sacrifices he had made along the way. Sophie found herself opening up in return, sharing stories about her own life and the challenges she had faced. There was a moment, somewhere between the second course and the dessert, when Sophie realized she was laughing more than she had in months. James was leaning across the table, his eyes fixed on hers, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she forgot he was her boss. She forgot he was married. As they left the restaurant, James walked her to her car. The air was cool, and Sophie wrapped her coat tighter around herself, suddenly aware of how close he was standing. "I had a great time tonight," James said, his voice soft. "Me too," Sophie admitted, her heart racing. For a moment, they just stood there, the city lights casting a golden glow around them. Then James reached out, his hand brushing against hers. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it sent a jolt through Sophie that she couldn't ignore. "I should go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, stepping back. "Good night, Sophie." "Good night," she replied, climbing into her car and driving away before she could change her mind. The next morning, Sophie told herself it had been a one-time thing, a moment of weakness that wouldn't happen again. But deep down, she knew better. She knew she was in too deep. And she wasn't the only one. For James, the dinner had been a turning point. He had known from the start that what he was doing was risky, even reckless. But for the first time in months, maybe even years, he had felt alive. Sophie made him feel seen in a way that Victoria no longer did. And while part of him felt guilty, another part was exhilarated. He told himself he could keep things under control, that he could pursue whatever this was with Sophie without letting it spiral out of hand. But as the days turned into weeks and their connection grew stronger, James began to realize just how much he was willing to risk to keep feeling that way. What he didn't realize was that the risks were far greater than he imagined, and the consequences of his choices would soon come crashing down around him. The weeks that followed their first dinner were a delicate balancing act. At work, James and Sophie maintained their professional decorum, careful not to draw attention to the growing connection between them. But beneath the surface, something unspoken lingered in every glance, every exchange, every moment they found themselves alone together. James told himself he was simply grateful for Sophie's support, for the way she seemed to make everything in his world a little easier. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. And Sophie, despite her best efforts to focus on her work, found herself looking forward to every interaction with James, her feelings growing harder to suppress with each passing day. One afternoon, as they wrapped up a meeting in James's office, he leaned back in his chair and smiled at her. "You know, we haven't properly celebrated yet." Sophie looked up from her notes, confused. "Celebrated what?" "The fact that we're finally ahead of schedule for the launch," James said. "It's no small feat, and you deserve credit for that. How about dinner tomorrow night?" "My treat." Sophie hesitated, her pen hovering above her notebook. She knew what this was, or at least, what it could be. But James's tone was casual, almost dismissive, as if he were simply checking off another item on his to-do list. "Sure," she said finally, keeping her voice light. Dinner sounds nice. The restaurant James chose was far grander than she had expected. When Sophie arrived the next evening, she found herself stepping into a world of crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and soft piano music drifting through the air. The maitre d' greeted her by name and escorted her to a private table near the floor-to-ceiling windows, where James was already waiting. He stood as she approached, his smile warm and genuine. "You made it." "Of course," Sophie replied, suddenly aware of how out of place she felt in the elegant setting. She had dressed carefully, choosing a simple yet flattering dress, but she couldn't help but feel self-conscious under James's gaze. The waiter arrived with a bottle of wine, and James waved off the menu, ordering for both of them with the ease of someone who frequented places like this. Sophie glanced around the room, taking in the opulence, and couldn't help but wonder what people would think if they knew who she was, or, more accurately, who she wasn't. "This is a lot," she said as the waiter poured their wine. "I wasn't expecting something so formal." James chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You deserve it, Sophie. You've been working harder than anyone, and I wanted to do something nice for you. Think of it as a thank you." Sophie nodded, but her unease lingered. She took a sip of wine, hoping it would steady her nerves, and decided to focus on the conversation rather than the setting. At first, they talked about work, the progress they had made, the challenges that still lay ahead. But as the courses arrived, one after another, their conversation began to shift. James spoke about his vision for the company, his ambitions for the future, and eventually, his frustrations. "It's not just the work," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "It's everything else that comes with it. The pressure, the constant scrutiny, and feeling like I'm doing it all alone." Sophie looked at him, her brow furrowed. "You're not alone, James. You have a whole team behind you." "I know," James said, swirling his wine in his glass. "But it's not the same. At the end of the day, the responsibility falls on me. And sometimes it feels like I can't even turn to the people closest to me." Sophie hesitated, unsure how to respond. "What about Victoria?" she asked carefully. James let out a bitter laugh. "Victoria and we've grown apart. She's busy with her own projects, and I'm busy with mine. We barely see each other anymore, let alone talk. And when we do, it's like we're speaking different languages." Sophie felt a pang of sympathy for him, but she also felt a twinge of guilt. She knew she shouldn't be hearing this, shouldn't be sitting across from him in a place like this, listening to him talk about his marriage. But she couldn't bring herself to leave. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "That sounds hard." James looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It is. But sitting here talking to you, it's the first time in a long time I've felt like someone actually gets it." Sophie's heart ached at his words. She wanted to tell him he wasn't alone, that she understood more than he realized. But she also knew that crossing that line would change everything. The dessert arrived, and they ate in silence for a while, the weight of their conversation hanging heavy between them. Sophie told herself this would be the last time, that she wouldn't let things go any further. But as James reached across the table and brushed her hand with his, she felt her resolve falter. "Thank you for being here," he said quietly. "It means more than you know." Sophie looked at him, her mind racing. She knew she should pull away, should tell him that this wasn't right. But instead, she found herself squeezing his hand in return. When the check arrived, James paid without a second thought and stood to help Sophie with her coat. As they walked out of the restaurant, the cool night air hit her like a wake-up call. She glanced at James, who was standing a little too close, and felt a rush of emotions she couldn't quite untangle: guilt, excitement, fear, and something dangerously close to hope. "I should get going," she said, her voice shaky. James nodded but didn't move. "Can I walk you to your car?" Sophie hesitated, then shook her head. "I'll be fine." "Good night, James." "Good night, Sophie," he said, his voice tinged with something that sounded almost like regret. As Sophie drove home, she replayed the evening in her mind, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She told herself it had been a mistake, that she wouldn't let it happen again. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. And as James watched her taillights disappear into the distance, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't come back from. The dinner between James and Sophie hadn't gone unnoticed. The restaurant, while exclusive, was also a favorite among the city's elite, a place where deals were made, connections were nurtured, and secrets were sometimes uncovered. Among the other diners that night had been an acquaintance of Victoria's, someone who recognized James immediately and noted the unfamiliar woman seated across from him. The next morning, Victoria received a message. It was casual, wrapped in the polite vagueness of concern, but its meaning was unmistakable. Spotted James at La Belle last night. Thought it was a business dinner until I noticed how cozy he looked with his colleague. Hope all's well. Victoria read the message twice, her stomach tightening. She didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to set her phone down and focus on the cup of tea in front of her. She had long suspected something was off with James, but she had brushed it aside, telling herself she was overthinking. Now, faced with this confirmation, she couldn't ignore it anymore. That evening, she made a quiet decision. She would confront James, but not at home. If he was meeting Sophie again, as the tone of the message implied, she needed to see it for herself. A confrontation needed to be rooted in undeniable truth. 2 nights later, Victoria dressed carefully. She chose a fitted blazer and tailored trousers, striking the perfect balance between confidence and control. Her heart was pounding as she left the house, but outwardly she was composed. She knew James well enough to predict his patterns, and sure enough, when she called the maitre d' at La Belle, she was told James had reserved a private table for 2. By the time she arrived, she felt as though she'd been holding her breath for hours. The restaurant was as elegant as ever, its subdued lighting casting a soft glow on the polished floors. Victoria paused just inside the entrance, scanning the room for James. She spotted him in the far corner, his back to her, sitting with Sophie. Victoria's lips tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She walked to the bar and ordered a drink, settling onto a stool where she could observe them without being noticed. From her vantage point, she could see James leaning slightly towards Sophie, his expression animated, his smile far more relaxed than it had been at home in months. Sophie, for her part, looked nervous yet flattered, her cheeks faintly pink as she laughed at something James had said. For a moment, Victoria felt paralyzed. The scene unfolding before her was confirmation of what she had feared, yet seeing it in person struck a chord she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung. It was the ease with which James seemed to have moved into this new dynamic. He looked happy. The waiter arrived with their dessert, and as James leaned in closer to Sophie, his hand brushed hers. Victoria watched as Sophie hesitated, glancing down at their hands before tentatively smiling. That was all Victoria needed. Setting her glass down with deliberate care, she stood and made her way toward their table. Neither James nor Sophie noticed her approach at first. It wasn't until she stopped beside them, her shadow falling over the table, that James looked up. His smile faltered instantly, his eyes widening in shock. "Victoria," he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and dread. Sophie froze, her face draining of color, as she recognized the woman standing before her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Victoria's expression was unreadable, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the turmoil swirling beneath the surface. "Hello, James," she said evenly, her eyes flicking briefly to Sophie before returning to her husband. "I didn't realize you were having such an intimate business meeting." James scrambled to stand, nearly knocking over his glass in the process. "This isn't what it looks like," he began, his voice faltering as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. Victoria raised a single eyebrow, her gaze piercing. "Oh, I'm sure it's exactly what it looks like." Sophie, still rooted to her chair, found her voice at last. "Mrs. Harrington, Victoria held up a hand, cutting her off. "Please, Sophie. I think we both know there's nothing you can say right now that will make this any less humiliating." Sophie's mouth snapped shut, her eyes dropping to the table in shame. James stepped closer to Victoria, his hand outstretched as though to reassure her. "Victoria, please, let me explain. Explain?" Victoria interrupted, her voice still calm but laced with steel. "You think there's an explanation for this that will make it okay? Because I'd love to hear it." James looked helplessly between her and Sophie, searching for the right words but finding none. Victoria exhaled slowly, her expression softening, though her tone remained firm. "You know, James, I've been wondering for months what's been going on with you. Why you've been so distant. Why you've stopped looking at me the way you used to. And now, here we are." She turned her gaze to Sophie, who was visibly wilting under the weight of Victoria's presence. "And you," Victoria said, her voice quieter but no less cutting. "I expected better." Sophie blinked rapidly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Victoria didn't respond, instead turning her attention back to James. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, an unspoken battle waging between them. Then, with a slight shake of her head, Victoria stepped back. "I'll leave you to your dessert," she said coolly, her voice regaining its composure. "Enjoy it while it lasts." Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and walked away, her head held high. Every step she took felt like a victory, though her heart ached with the knowledge of what she had just witnessed. James stood frozen, watching her retreating figure until she disappeared from view. Then he sank back into his chair, his face pale and drawn. Sophie sat across from him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her expression a mixture of guilt and despair. Neither of them spoke. The weight of Victoria's words hung heavily in the air, a silent reminder of the consequences they had unleashed. For the first time, James felt the full force of what he had done, not just to Victoria, but to himself. And as the soft strains of piano music continued to fill the restaurant, he realized that nothing would ever be the same. The drive home from the restaurant was a blur for James. The air felt heavy in his lungs, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The memory of Victoria's calm yet devastating demeanor replayed over and over in his mind, each word a dagger he couldn't shake. Her icy composure was more terrifying than any anger she could have shown, and the weight of her silence, as she walked away, crushed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. When he arrived at their penthouse, Victoria was already there. She stood in the living room, her posture regal, a glass of wine in her hand. The dim lighting cast long shadows across her figure, making her look like an avenging specter. She didn't turn when she heard the door open, didn't acknowledge his presence until he spoke. "Victoria," James began, his voice hoarse. "Let me explain." "Explain?" Victoria finally turned, arching a brow as she regarded him with an unreadable expression. "By all means, James. Explain to me why I found my husband dining with another woman, looking at her the way he used to look at me." James faltered under her gaze, the carefully constructed excuses he'd rehearsed on the drive unraveling in an instant. "It wasn't what it looked like," he stammered. "Sophie and you've failed," Victoria interrupted, her tone cold and final. James froze, the cryptic remark landing like a blow to his chest. "What are you talking about?" Victoria set her wine glass down on the table, her movements deliberate. "You think this was just a coincidence? That Sophie Bennett simply walked into your life and charmed you by accident?" James blinked, confusion clouding his features. "What are you saying?" Victoria stepped closer, her heels clicking against the floor, each step measured and deliberate. "Sophie isn't just your secretary, James. She's someone I've known for years. A mutual acquaintance, you could say. And she didn't take this job by chance. I hired her." The words hit James like a freight train. He stared at Victoria, disbelief etched into his features. "You hired her?" he echoed, as though saying it aloud would make it less true. Victoria nodded, her expression unyielding. "I needed to know, James. For months, I've felt you slipping away, felt the distance between us growing wider. I asked myself if I was imagining it, if I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. So I decided to test you. James took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. A test? You're saying this was all some kind of trap? Call it what you want, Victoria said, her voice steady. I needed to know where your loyalties lay. And now I do. He shook his head, his mind reeling. Sophie, she wouldn't. She didn't know? Victoria finished for him. Oh, she knew. She agreed to help me. She was reluctant at first, I'll give her that. But in the end, she saw the merit in what I was trying to do. As if on cue, the door opened, and Sophie stepped inside. Her face was pale, her shoulders tense, but her gaze was resolute. She looked between James and Victoria, then took a hesitant step forward. Mr. Harrington, she began softly, her voice trembling just enough to betray her nerves. I'm so sorry. James turned to her, his expression a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. You were in on this? He demanded. All of it? Sophie nodded, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. Yes. But I didn't want to hurt you. I swear I didn't. Victoria asked for my help, and you what? James snapped, his voice rising. You thought you'd play along? Pretend to be interested? Let me make a fool of myself? It wasn't like that, Sophie said quickly. I didn't mean for it to go this far. But as we worked together, I realized you weren't happy. And that made me feel even worse, because I knew what it would mean for Victoria if I failed. James finished bitterly, his jaw tightening. He turned back to Victoria, his eyes blazing. Do you hear this? She's admitting it went too far. She's admitting this wasn't just some test. You set me up, Victoria. You pushed me into this. Victoria didn't flinch. Don't you dare blame me for your choices, James. I gave you every opportunity to prove me wrong, to show me that the man I married still existed. But you didn't. You let yourself be drawn in. You let yourself betray me. James ran a hand through his hair, his chest heaving. This is insane. Do you hear yourself? You orchestrated this entire thing. You manipulated me, manipulated Sophie. And now you're standing there, acting like you're the victim? I didn't make you lean in, James, Victoria said sharply. I didn't make you take her to dinner. I didn't make you break the vows we swore to each other. That was all you. Sophie shifted uncomfortably, her guilt written plainly across her face. Please, she said quietly. This isn't helping anyone. Victoria, I think maybe I should. Stay, Victoria interrupted, her gaze still fixed on James. You're just as much a part of this as he is. James exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he paced the room. So what now? He asked, his voice heavy with sarcasm. Do I grovel? Beg for forgiveness? Is that what you want, Victoria? Victoria folded her arms, her expression unyielding. What I want is irrelevant. What matters is whether you even care enough to try. James stopped pacing, his shoulders sagging as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. For a moment, he said nothing, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of everything. Then he turned to Sophie, his eyes narrowing. And you, he said, his voice low. You played me. You pretended to be someone I could trust. Someone who understood me. Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. James let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow and cold. Sorry doesn't even begin to cover it. Victoria stepped forward, her gaze never wavering. It's not about apologies, James. It's about what happens next. Because after tonight, nothing will ever be the same. James stared at her, his chest tightening as the full weight of her words sank in. And for the first time in his life, the man who had always seemed so sure of himself, so in control, had no idea what to say. James stood frozen in the living room, the weight of Victoria's words crashing down on him like a tidal wave. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the man he believed himself to be with the man she saw, a man who had failed not only her but himself. The betrayal he felt at being manipulated was dwarfed by the realization that her plan had worked. He had fallen into the trap she set, and in doing so, he had proven her fears right. "You planned this," he said finally, his voice low, almost hoarse. "You orchestrated the entire thing, used Sophie, used me, just to prove a point." Victoria's eyes flared with restrained fury, her calm exterior beginning to crack. "Don't you dare make this about me," she said, her tone sharp as a blade. "Yes, I set the stage, James, but you played the part. You chose this. You chose to confide in her instead of me. You chose to let your vows mean less than they should. I didn't mean for it to go this far." James shot back, his voice rising, frustration thick in his tone. "I didn't mean to what?" Victoria interrupted, stepping closer. "To betray me? To undermine everything we've built? Or did you think it didn't count as long as I didn't find out?" James clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Victoria snapped. "I understand that somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as your partner. I understand that the man who used to look at me like I was the only thing that mattered now looks at his secretary with that same spark in his eyes. It wasn't like that," James argued, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I never wanted to hurt you. And yet here we are," Victoria said, her voice softer now, though no less devastating. "Your intentions don't matter, James. Your actions do." Sophie, who had been standing silently by the door, shifted uncomfortably. Her presence felt intrusive, though she knew this was as much her mess as theirs. Clearing her throat, she spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. "Maybe I should leave," she said hesitantly, her eyes darting between James and Victoria. This is between you two." Victoria didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on James. Then she nodded, almost absently. "Yes, Sophie. I think that would be best." Sophie hesitated, her guilt evident in the way she lingered, as though searching for something to say that might soften the blow. But there was nothing. Finally, she turned and left, the sound of the door clicking shut echoing through the tense silence. Victoria turned back to James, her expression hard. "You want to talk about betrayal? Let's talk about how you've taken our marriage for granted." James blinked, startled by the shift in her tone. "That's not fair, isn't it?" Victoria interrupted, her voice sharp. "You think I haven't noticed the way you've been pulling away? The way you throw yourself into work, into anything that doesn't involve me? Do you even remember the last time we had dinner together? The last time we laughed together?" James opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He couldn't remember, and that realization hit him harder than he expected. "We built a life together, James," Victoria continued, her voice trembling now, the anger giving way to something more vulnerable. "A life that I thought mattered to both of us. But somewhere along the line, you stopped showing up for it. You stopped showing up for me." Her words struck a chord deep within him, stirring feelings he had buried beneath layers of denial and excuses. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the truth of her accusations left him speechless. "I've fought for this marriage, James," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "But I can't fight for it alone. And I certainly can't fight for it when you're not even willing to fight for me." James ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. "I'm not the only one who's changed, Victoria. You've been so focused on your charities, your causes, you're never home. We're like strangers living under the same roof." Victoria's eyes narrowed, her anger flaring again. "So this is my fault now? Because I dared to have a life outside of being your wife? That's not what I'm saying," James said quickly, though the frustration in his voice undermined his attempt at diplomacy. I don't know how we got here." Victoria stared at him, her expression softening just enough to reveal the hurt beneath her anger. "Neither do I," she said quietly. "But we're here, James. And I don't know if we can come back from it." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. James felt a pang of panic, his mind racing for something to say, something that could undo the damage he had done. But Victoria wasn't waiting for a response. She turned and walked toward the door, pausing only long enough to grab her coat. "Where are you going?" James asked, his voice filled with desperation. "I don't know," Victoria said, her hand on the doorknob. "But I can't stay here right now. Not like this." And with that, she was gone, leaving James alone in the echoing silence of their once warm home. He sank onto the couch, his head in his hands, the magnitude of his failure settling over him like a suffocating weight. For the first time in his life, James Harrington, master of his universe, a man who had built an empire with his own hands, felt completely and utterly powerless. The days after Victoria left were quiet and heavy. The penthouse, once a symbol of success and shared dreams, felt hollow in her absence. James wandered through the rooms aimlessly, haunted by the echoes of their arguments and the cold finality of her departure. He couldn't shake the image of her walking out the door, the look in her eyes a mixture of pain, disappointment, and something he couldn't fully name but knew he had caused. He tried to throw himself into work, but even that felt meaningless. Every meeting, every email, every task reminded him of Sophie, of the choices he had made, and of how far he had fallen. He spent nights alone in his office, staring at the city lights, his mind racing with memories of better times, moments when he and Victoria had been happy, truly happy, before everything had started to unravel. He thought about the early days of their marriage, when their love had felt invincible. They had been partners in every sense of the word, building a life together brick by brick. He remembered the late nights spent talking about their dreams, the quiet mornings when they lingered over coffee, the laughter that had once come so easily. But somewhere along the way, he had let that slip away. He had let his ambition, his pride, and his relentless pursuit of success overshadow the things that truly mattered. James could pinpoint the moments now, like stepping stones that led to this point. The times he had chosen work over their anniversary dinners. The times he had brushed off her concerns with a dismissive wave of his hand, telling her she worried too much. The times he had let silence replace the conversations they used to have. He had taken her for granted, assuming she would always be there, always waiting, always understanding. But she wasn't waiting anymore. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut. Victoria had always been strong, always willing to fight for what mattered to her. And now, for the first time, James realized he had to fight for her. Not with grand gestures or empty promises, but with honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to change. Sitting alone in his office one night, James pulled out a piece of stationery, something Victoria had always insisted they keep, though he had mocked the idea of handwritten letters in an age of emails and texts. Now, it felt like the only way to truly say what needed to be said. He stared at the blank page for a long time, his pen hovering above it. Words didn't come easily to him, not when they were personal, not when they exposed the parts of himself he had spent so long keeping hidden. But if he was going to fix this, if there was even a chance of fixing this, he knew he had to start here. "Victoria, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't even know if you want to hear from me. But I need to say these things, even if it's too late. I failed you. I failed us. And I don't have an excuse for that. There are reasons, sure, work, stress, the pressures of building something from nothing. But none of those reasons justify the choices I made, the way I let you feel like you weren't a priority in my life. You were. You always were. I just didn't show it the way I should have. You once told me that love isn't just about big moments, it's about the little ones, the everyday choices that show someone they matter. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. I let the little moments slip by, thinking I could make up for them with grand gestures later. But later never came, and now I see the damage that caused. I don't blame you for leaving. I don't blame you for testing me, for needing to know if I still valued what we had. What hurts the most is that I failed that test, not because I didn't love you, but because I was too caught up in my own pride to see what was slipping through my fingers. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to earn it. I want to be better for you, for us. I know it won't be easy, and I know words aren't enough. But if there's any part of you that still believes in me, in us, I'm begging you to let me prove that I can change. You've always been the best part of my life, Victoria. And I don't want to lose you. Not like this. Yours always. James, when he finished, his hand was trembling. He read over the letter, feeling the weight of every word, every admission, every promise. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had truly opened himself up. The next morning, he mailed the letter, unsure if Victoria would even read it, let alone respond. The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he knew he couldn't control her reaction. All he could do was hope. Meanwhile, Victoria sat in a small rental cottage she had retreated to after leaving the penthouse. The days had been a mix of reflection and solitude, a chance to process everything that had happened. She replayed James's words in her mind, his expressions, his attempts to explain himself, and the look of desperation in his eyes as she walked away. She didn't know if his remorse was genuine or just another calculated move to keep her from leaving for good. James had always been a master of persuasion, a man who could charm his way out of almost anything. But this time felt different. This time, she had seen a vulnerability in him that she hadn't seen in years. When the letter arrived, Victoria hesitated to open it. She recognized James's handwriting immediately, the deliberate, precise strokes of a man who hated showing his imperfections. She stared at the envelope for a long time, her fingers tracing the edges, before finally breaking the seal. As she read, tears welled in her eyes. The words were raw, unpolished, and deeply personal. She could feel his pain, his regret, his desperate hope that he could somehow make things right. For the first time in weeks, she felt the tiniest flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel, the possibility of reconciliation. But she wasn't ready to decide, not yet. James had said he wanted to earn her forgiveness, and she needed to see if he truly meant it. If he was willing to do the hard work, not just to fix their marriage, but to fix himself. As she folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, Victoria realized that, for the first time in weeks, she wasn't thinking about the end of their story. She was thinking about the possibility of a new beginning. But whether that beginning would include James remained to be seen. James paced the penthouse living room, his mind racing. Victoria hadn't responded to his letter, but she hadn't rejected it either. That small silence, that lack of finality, gave him hope, fragile, tenuous hope that perhaps not all was lost. He had spent days ruminating on their past, trying to pinpoint a moment that could bridge the gap between them. And then it hit him. Their first real date. Before the penthouse, the boardrooms, and the headlines, there had been a quiet, unassuming night when they were just two people figuring each other out. It hadn't been extravagant. He'd taken her to a small Italian bistro tucked away in the corner of the city, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths, flickering candles, and a violinist who wandered between tables. It had been simple but meaningful, and it had marked the moment he realized he wanted to build a life with her. James decided to recreate that evening, down to the smallest detail. He called the restaurant, praying it was still in business. To his relief, it was. He reserved the same table and requested the same violinist, even if their hair had turned gray since that night. He spent hours rehearsing what he wanted to say, knowing that sincerity would be his only ally. When the evening came, he sent a message to Victoria, asking her to meet him. He kept it brief, knowing anything more might overwhelm her. Victoria. I've made a reservation at Trattoria di Luca, where we went on our first date. I understand if you don't want to come, but I hope you will. No pressure. Just a chance to talk. James. He stared at his phone for what felt like hours, waiting for her response. It came just as doubt began to creep in. I'll meet you there. 8 p.m. The relief was immediate but short-lived. James knew the hardest part was yet to come. When Victoria arrived at the restaurant, she paused in the doorway, taking in the familiar setting. The checkered tablecloths, the soft glow of the candles, the faint hum of the violinist, it was all as she remembered. For a moment, nostalgia tugged at her, but she quickly tempered it. She was here to listen, not to forgive. Not yet. James stood as she approached the table, his expression a mixture of gratitude and nervousness. "You came," he said, his voice softer than she expected. Victoria nodded, her gaze steady. "I almost didn't." "I'm glad you did," James said, pulling out her chair. He waited until she was seated before sitting down himself, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything unsaid hung between them, thick and oppressive. Then James took a deep breath and began. "I know this doesn't fix anything," he said, his voice earnest. "But I wanted to remind you of a time when we were happy, when everything felt simple. I've spent so much time thinking about how we got here, and I keep coming back to this night, not because it was perfect, but because it was us. Just us." Victoria's expression remained guarded, but she didn't interrupt. She let him speak, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her water glass. "I know I've hurt you," James continued. "I know I've let you down in ways I can't take back. But I meant what I wrote in that letter. I want to be better for you, for us. I know it won't be easy, and I know it won't happen overnight. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Victoria leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Words are easy, James. Promises even more so. What I need to see is action. Consistency. This isn't about one grand gesture or one heartfelt letter. It's about what happens after this." James nodded, his throat tightening. "I understand. And I'm ready to prove it to you, every day, in every way I can." Victoria studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that the man sitting across from her was the same man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. But trust, once broken, was not so easily repaired. "This isn't just about what happened with Sophie," she said finally. "This is about everything that led up to it. The distance, the silence, the way you let your ambition take over our lives. Do you even know how lonely I've been, James? How many nights I sat alone, wondering if you even saw me anymore." James's heart ached at her words, the raw pain in her voice cutting through him like a knife. "I see you now," he said quietly. "I see everything I've been blind to, everything I took for granted. And I hate that it took losing you to realize it. But I do realize it, Victoria. And I don't want to lose you for good." Victoria sighed, her gaze dropping to the table. She wanted to believe him, but the scars of his betrayal ran deep. Still, there was something in his eyes, a vulnerability, a sincerity that made her pause. "I don't know if we can fix this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if we're going to try, I need you to understand that it's not about fixing what's broken. It's about rebuilding something new. Something better." James nodded, his jaw tightening with emotion. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said simply. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the violin filling the space between them. For the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt like a beginning. When the meal ended, James walked Victoria to her car. The air was cool, the city lights casting a golden glow over the street. He hesitated, unsure if he should reach for her hand, but Victoria made the decision for him. She turned to face him, her expression soft but firm. "This doesn't mean I've forgiven you," she said. "But it does mean I'm willing to see if you're serious about change." James nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I won't let you down." Victoria gave him a small, tentative smile before getting into her car. As she drove away, James stood on the curb, watching until her taillights disappeared into the distance. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Rebuilding their marriage would be hard, and the path ahead was uncertain. But he was ready to take the first step, and every step after that. For now, it was enough. And so, James and Victoria's story reminds us of the fragility of trust, the weight of choices, and the hard work it takes to rebuild what's been broken. While their future remains uncertain, one thing is clear: healing requires not just love, but the courage to confront the truth, to take responsibility, and to grow. What would you do in their situation? Do you think their relationship can survive? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.